Hi, my name is Emily Esfahani Smith, and I am a writer and journalist in Washington, D.C. And I wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Power of Meaning: Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I learned writing that book about meaning, about this yearning we all have to lead lives of significance, to do meaningful work, to have a sense of purpose in life. And I like to begin by talking a little bit about the story of Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor, who was a Jewish psychiatrist living in Vienna when the Nazis came to power. And in 1942, he and his family and his parents were arrested and taken to a Nazi concentration camp. 3 years later, when the camps were liberated, his family, his wife, who had been pregnant, had died, but he survived. And within a year of being released, he wrote a beautiful book called Man's Search for Meaning. And the book is all about his experiences in the camps and about the importance of finding meaning in suffering and how finding meaning in suffering can help people become more resilient. So Frankl talks a lot about how the people in the camps had lost everything. They'd lost their possessions, their freedom. Many had watched their loved ones perish in the gas chambers. And understandably, many had concluded that there was nothing more left to live for. But there were others who took a different perspective, who continued to believe that their lives were meaningful. And those people, Frankl found, were more resilient in the face of their horrendous circumstances and even more apt to survive, he said. And we know that this is true, that his kind of anecdotal findings bear out in recent empirical research, which shows that people who have a sense of meaning in life do experience greater longevity, are more resilient to suffering. And so Frankl tells the story of a couple of suicidal inmates that he counsels in the camps to kind of show the power of meaning. And he talks about how for both of these inmates, restoring in them the will to live was a matter of getting them to see that they had a purpose. There was something still expected of them in the future. And for one of them, it was the prospect of reuniting with his young son, who was living elsewhere in Europe in safety. And for the other, he was a scientist, and it was the prospect of returning to his life's work and kind of completing a series of scholarly books that he had begun before the war and which only he could complete because of his unique expertise. And so Frankl, looking at these stories, concluded, quoting the philosopher Nietzsche, that those who have a why for their existence can withstand almost any how. And I remember when I encountered Frankl's work for the first time in graduate school, where I was studying positive psychology, the science of well-being, it really struck me. And it really struck me because we tend to live in a world and a society, especially here in the West, where there's so much emphasis placed on happiness, this kind of state of feeling good and, finding happiness in our work. We're led to believe that happiness is the be all end all of life. But Frankl and some kind of thinkers and researchers in his tradition were proposing that there was another way to orient our lives, and that was towards the pursuit of meaning. And what I discovered in graduate school, as I was looking at Frankl's work and some similar research, new research on meaning, really surprised me. And one of the findings that I found particularly interesting was that, we know that rates of mental illness have been increasing for decades. Nearly every single indicator of suffering, from anxiety to depression to suicide, has been on the rise. And when researchers crunch the numbers to try to figure out what's going on, what's driving this rising tide of despair, what they find is that it's not a lack of happiness in people's lives, but a lack of meaning. And so I'm making this distinction because I think sometimes when we're not doing well in our lives, when we're struggling in some way, we tend to think that the solution is to make ourselves happier in some way. But actually, the solution is to do things and to find pursuits that are meaningful. Meaning kind of penetrates more deeply into the human psyche than happiness does. And we know now from many years of research within positive psychology and in other fields that, people who kind of emphasize and pursue happiness the way that our culture encourages us to do actually end up feeling unhappy and lonely, whereas people who orient their lives and have an attitude towards their work and towards their lives in general of meaning, of searching for meaning, not only kind of experience a deeper sense of fulfillment as they go through life, but if they're professionals, they're more productive and engaged with their work. If they're students, they get better grades and do better in general in school and in their activities. If they're going through a really difficult time, as Frankl found, they're more resilient. And finally, as people reach the end of their lives and are kind of confronted with the final challenge of life, which is dying, they're much more at peace with the fact that they'll die. So there's something really about meaning that's powerful. And, this led me to really trying to understand, what is it that we have to have in our lives in order for them to be meaningful? If meaning is so important, how can we bring more meaning into our lives? Is it a separate journey for each of us, or are there certain principles that we can each rely upon? And what I found as I, sifted through thousands of pages of research, read through philosophy, and interviewed many people about their own stories, was that there were these 4 themes that came up again and again in what people were telling me and in what the research was saying. And these 4 themes I call in my book the pillars of meaning. And so I'll say what they are briefly, and then I'll quickly give a little snapshot of each one. So the first is belonging, having a sense of belonging in life. The second is purpose. The third is transcendence. And then finally, storytelling. So just to back up a little bit, the way psychologists and philosophers define meaning is they say the defining feature of a meaningful life is connecting and contributing to something beyond yourself, whether that's the work that you do, a sense of spirituality, your family, a cause that you want to devote your life to, this kind of self-transcendent component. And when people say that their lives are meaningful in research, it's because 3 conditions have been satisfied. The first is they believe their lives have a sense of significance. The second is they believe their lives have goals and purposes that bring them value. And then the third is that they believe their lives are coherent. So their own story makes sense to them and the world at large makes sense to them. And so these 4 pillars of belonging, purpose, storytelling, and transcendence all contribute to that sense of meaningfulness, of making our lives feel like they do have a sense of significance and coherence and of course, purpose. So belonging, we hear a lot about how relationships are important to well-being, but belonging is really about being in a certain kind of relationship, one in which you're valued for who you are intrinsically and where you value the other person for who they are intrinsically. And I think this is an important point because you can imagine being in a relationship, even a significant relationship to a boss or a spouse, where you're not valued for who you are, but for, what you achieve or how you look, or in the certain cases of gangs and cults, for who you hate and not for who you are deep down. But what we know from the research is that moments of belonging, first of all, they can occur with anyone. So you can just have any kind of passing experience of, where you sit next to somebody on a plane, or you have an encounter at the water cooler where you really make a connection with someone, where you really see one another and tune into one another. And these experiences of belonging can kind of elevate people. And so belonging is something that you can cultivate with anyone if you choose to lean into the moment with them. And it's a choice that you can make. You can choose to kind of build this pillar with anyone in the moment. So it's not like it's just a feature of some relationships and not a feature of others. And within the work setting, it's especially important to cultivate belonging because we know from research that when people feel like they matter to others at work, when they're treated like they matter by their managers, by their colleagues, whether they are the top level manager or the custodian in the hallways, that they rate their work as more meaningful. And when they're treated like they don't belong, like that they're rejected in some way, they not only rate their work as less meaningful, but their own lives as less meaningful. And so we see in the research, simple gestures can cultivate belonging, like making eye contact with the custodian and smiling and thanking them, inviting, somebody to a potluck lunch, kind of including people in what you're doing. These small ways to build belonging. The next pillar is purpose. And psychologists define purpose as a goal or a value that orients your life and organizes your pursuits. And purpose can come in all shapes and sizes. So, it may be that one person's purpose is to change the world in some grand way, to end poverty, to cure cancer. But purpose can also be much more local. Many parents told me that their purpose was raising their children. I spoke to, accountants and lawyers who said that their purpose was serving their clients during stressful periods of their lives. And so, we can kind of find purpose in the different things that we do. And that's why I like to think about purpose as less as something that you have to kind of turn over a million different rocks until you find your one true purpose, and more as something where you live with purpose. You kind of have a mindset of purpose toward everything that you do. And there's a really charming example that comes from Okinawa, Japan, of this. Okinawa is one of the places in the world where there is a large concentration of centenarians, of people living to and beyond the age of 100 in a very healthy way. And when researchers try to understand, okay, what is it about these places in the world that produces such health and longevity, what they find in Okinawa is that the key is purpose. And when they speak to these centenarians, the centenarians tell them that their lives are infused with a sense of purpose, where they're doing simple, kind of ordinary things, things that make up all of our lives, but that they kind of bring an intentionality to. So, for example, one person talked about playing his lute, a musical instrument, for others, kind of creating beauty for them. Another was the town's priestess in the Shinto religion, and she talked about praying to the ancestors on behalf of the community. Another was, just talked about checking in on her friends. Everyone's getting older, and so kind of being there for them. So these small ways that we can find purpose. And what those little stories all have in common, which is really relevant to finding purpose in the work that we do and in our own endeavors, personally or professionally, is that they kind of involve a service mindset and connecting to something bigger than ourselves. So, one of the people who I interviewed for my book, she was a hospital cleaner, and she was part of this larger study about meaning at work. And she said, my purpose isn't cleaning bedpans and mopping the floor, it's healing sick people. So connecting what we do to that larger picture. The third pillar is transcendence. And transcendent experiences are these kind of moments of awe and wonder where you lose your sense of self a little bit and feel like you're connecting to something mysterious and sacred. There are a lot of different ways to experience this pillar. Many people experience it in nature, others through kind of religious rituals or contemplative practices like meditation, but you can also experience it in the work that you do. As a writer, I can sometimes get so absorbed in my writing that I lose all sense of time and of space of where I am, and kind of have this experience of self-loss that makes me feel very immersed in and engaged with the work that I'm doing. So there are lots of different ways to experience transcendence. And what's really interesting about this particular pillar is that people who have these transcendent experiences rate them as among the most meaningful ones of their lives. And you don't have to kind of travel to a monastery or go to the Grand Canyon to experience transcendence. There's one study where researchers had students in the study look up at these beautiful eucalyptus trees just for 60 seconds, for 1 minute. But in that moment of kind of stillness, they had an experience of awe and wonder. And later on, that caused this kind of shift in their values, where when they were put in a situation to help somebody, they were much more likely to help that person. The final pillar is storytelling. And storytelling is really about the story you tell yourself, about how you became the person that you are today. And this pillar, I find, really resonates with people because we don't always realize that we're the authors of our own stories and can therefore change the way that we're telling them. Sometimes, we tell stories that hold us back in some way, stories about how inadequate and unworthy we are, what failures we are. And we know that people who are leading meaningful lives tend to tell stories about their lives that are more hopeful and positive, that are defined by what one researcher, Dan McAdams, calls redemption, growth, and love. So as you're thinking about your own story, whether it's the story that you're telling about the kind of professional you are, or the kind of parent you are, or just the kind of person you are in the world, ask yourself, is this a story that has kind of positive currents running through it, or is this a story that's holding me back in some way? We know that people have a very strong negativity bias, and so we're much more likely to focus on the negative than on the positive. And what this means is that when we're telling stories about our lives, we might not be giving the positive things that happen the due and the justice that they deserve. So kind of keeping an eye on the positive, giving it its due, and weaving it into the story is important for leading a meaningful life. So those are the 4 pillars of meaning: belonging, purpose, transcendence, and storytelling. And I hope that these have helped you kind of, take meaning off its pedestal a little bit and see that we can cultivate meaning and bring meaning into our lives in these different ways that we can control, these different pillars that we can build. Thank you.